Hi, my name is Nora, and I am really glad that you came to hear about some misconceptions of the growing participator approach, or the GPA, as it's often called. So my dream when I went overseas was that I would learn the language and make friends with the host people and really be able to dive into community and life with them and learn their culture and just do everything in their language. That was my dream. Drop a yes in the chat if that was your dream too. Thanks. But things get in the way of realizing that dream. And that's really kind of why we're here at ICLL, isn't it? To help people realize that dream and to get them past the things that get in the way. Well, one of the things that can get in the way of realizing this dream is misunderstandings about second language acquisitions or approaches like the growing participator approach. So that's why we're going to talk about misconceptions of the growing participator approach. Why did Dr. Greg Thompson and his wife Angela, why did they conceive the GPA approach? Well, they saw a problem. You see, there were too many people in the world that lived their whole lives without ever knowing a Christian. And that's how people become Christians in general, is by knowing a Christian. I mean, obviously there are exceptions, but in general, that's how it happens. So what did they do? They re-envisioned language learning so that relationships would be at the center of it, so that people would be getting to know Christians right from the very start of their time overseas. And then they could get to know the Christians and they could get to know Jesus through the Christians. So what is the GPA? This is a quote from my friend Cheryl's thesis. She says, the GPA provides a framework for gradual increased participation in a foreign language community where participants learn in relationship with people in the community. It provides an alternative to approaches that do not promote relationships in a cross-cultural setting. I'll give you some ways to find out more about the GPA later in the talk. So we're going to talk about these misconceptions of the GPA. Well, where did I get this list? I did an informal survey of language learners, language coaches, language trainers, and I got their input about what they had heard or what they had experienced with the GPA. And I also had a really long conversation with Greg Thompson and his wife, Angela, about this. So that's where I got this list. So as we go through these misconceptions, please jot down any in the chat that you'd like to understand better, because we're going to have time later during the Q&A to dig in a little more. Misconception number one, the GPA is for everyone. No. If someone is totally committed to another approach and having success, fantastic, go for it. There's another misconception that would say that if you haven't had success using the GPA, you're a failure. Absolutely not. You know, Greg likes to talk about Babel and how the language barriers that came out as a result of Babel don't stop the gospel from spreading, but help it to spread. Why? Because the people that carry the gospel, the treasure bearers, have to come in low under the language barriers, humbly as learners. And that way the focus is on the treasure that they're carrying and not on them themselves. And so this humility that's required by coming in low and even having some failures and setbacks, this serves to advance God's kingdom. So there's another misconception that would say that the GPA is the silver bullet to language learning, the magical thing that makes it easy and without effort. Also a misconception. The GPA doesn't claim this. What it does claim is to put the emphasis on relationships. So another misconception is that using the GPA is flowers, kittens, sunshine, and happiness every day. But entering deeply into our host friends' lives as we do in the GPA means we enter into their pain and their struggle as well. This is obviously not easy at all. And furthermore, misunderstandings of the GPA have hurt people. If this is you, I am so sorry this happened to you. If you'd like to tell me your story later, here's my email. I would be honored to listen to your story. So another misconception is that the GPA is just a bundle of techniques for language learning. Or if you've done total physical response, you've done the GPA. To understand why this isn't quite accurate, it's helpful to understand the division of it into three sections, three levels really: the approach, the method, and the technique. And this is a division that you find throughout the second language acquisition literature. So an approach is general and theoretical. A method is a specific set of procedures that are compatible with an approach, not a method, like it says on the slide. And techniques are specific types of learning activities that are used in one or more methods. So you can see the same techniques in a variety of different methods. It's the approach that undergirds everything. That's what really makes the difference. So the GPA is an approach which puts relationships with host people at the center of all we do. The method consists of 6 phases that are named for how host people see us in each phase. So phase 1, we're just beginning, so we're just starting to connect. And then phase 2, we're emerging as someone who has a personality and you can get to know as a host person. And then phase 3, we're fully knowable and people can really get to know us. Phase 4 is built on deep personal relationships. Phase 5 is widening understanding of the host culture and host people. And phase 6 is ever participating and growing. So the techniques are different from phase to phase. They change as we grow more into our host world. So I'd like to give you an example of implementing the GPA approach, but not the 6-phase method or the specific techniques for the most part. And it's my French study. So I had to go to a French school for my visa, and it was pretty traditional. But when I wasn't in class, I was in class 4 hours a day. But what made the difference for me to succeed in learning French is what I did when I wasn't in class. So when I wasn't in class, I dove into communities of practice as much as I could with French people. I was in 2 Bible studies with French people. I sang in 2 choirs. I did an Alpha course with French people. And then in my free time, I watched French movies, American movies dubbed into French, because that was easier for me to understand at first. Later, I could watch the French movies and understand them. And I read Reader's Digest because my friend Pam Eckerd said I should read Reader's Digest. And it was fantastic for learning all sorts of vocabulary. And I just read all sorts of books too. I started out with like middle school level books. And then as I learned more language, I'd read more complicated books. I read voraciously. But wait, the GPA doesn't let you learn to read and write. Well, sure it does. In a comprehension-led way that changes from phase to phase. Basically, the difference is that you're going to focus on learning to read first, not learning to write first. And you're only going to learn to read words that you already know. So for instance, I'm coaching a couple in Thailand that are beginners and they're learning to read in Thai. And I had them gather a bunch of words that they understand and wanted to know how to read. And I was thinking it would be stuff like milk and stuff like that, so they could be able to navigate in the grocery store. But they wanted to learn to read the word toilet, which I thought was a very good choice. The GPA centers that teach Arabic, where people grow into the Arabic language cultural world, they start out right away with people learning to recognize and read the Arabic letters. So it's just not true that the GPA doesn't let you learn to read and write. What is a little different is, this time that we have with our language helper or our nurturer, this precious time, this limited time we have with this precious person who's so patient with us. We don't waste our time learning letter formation with the person. We can do that on our own time. Well, you can't talk at all during phase one. No, talk your head off if that makes you happy. Just don't talk during your time with your nurturer for the first 30 hours. So 30 hours, if you're doing 20 hours a week with a nurturer, if you're full-time, that's a week and a half where you're playing listening games and understanding games and not talking games. And the GPA takes about 1,500 hours to get through the 5 phases, depending on the language. And so 30 of those 1,500 hours, that's 2% of your time with your nurturer. So, and remember, your times with your nurturer are one thing, you're playing listening games. But GPA doesn't forbid you from learning other things, other ways on your own time. My friend Graham read a grammar book for fun in his free time. That was fun for him. Other people say that the problem with playing this listening games, this silent period, is that it's trying to mimic first language acquisition. We can't mimic first language acquisition. We're adults. This is our second language, maybe our third language or our fourth language. It's not the same as learning our first language. What we're trying to do with focusing on understanding during those first 30 hours, that first 2% of our time, is we're just giving our brain time to process one thing, just sound and meaning. Because understanding and speaking are two very different processes. And understanding in a new language, that's really hard. So we have to give concentrated time to practicing understanding. Another misconception is that the GPA doesn't do grammar. Well, if you know a little bit about grammar and how languages work, then the grammar that's woven throughout the 6 phases is obvious to you. If you don't have this background, then you need to get some outside help to implement the GPA, and we'll talk about what that can look like a few slides from now. Now, someone who says this might mean that the GPA doesn't do traditional, explicit drill and skill on grammar rules. Well, that's true, and it's based on research on effective language learning. Other people you might hear say, there's no flexibility in the approach. I don't need to learn these words. Well, then learn other words. Or this book that I'm supposed to use has a hippo with a tutu on. If this book doesn't work for you, use a different book. There's lots of books out there. I also hear the GPA contrasted with principled eclecticism, when the GPA is really kind of the definition of principled eclecticism, pulling techniques from a whole wide range of methods that are out there. And the principles that it's based on, they're cute. Communing, understanding, talking, and evolving. So communing, focusing on doing something in relationship with a person. Understanding, making sure that we're practicing understanding and getting that process going in our brain, but not neglecting talking at all for our T. And then evolving. What we do at the very beginning is different from what we do in the middle, is different from what we do at the end of our growth in, well, it never ends, but once we're pretty far along in our growth into a new world. So it's cute. Another misconception is that the GPA isn't based on research. Well, noticing, input flooding, negotiation of meaning, implicit grammatical instruction, corrective feedback, recognition versus recall, the output hypothesis, these are all really well-researched and mainstream ideas in second language acquisition. Of course, there is some disagreement about it. What would people publish about if they didn't have something to disagree with? You know, I can't tell you how many times in my PhD classes, one of my professors will say something and I'll think, ah, that's where Greg got that. It's really based in the research. Another misconception is that you can just hand someone the GPA materials and turn them loose. Everyone needs a coach. That's why I'm a coach, because I needed a coach. I tried to learn Embedi May. I knew second language acquisition. I had Greg's materials, but I got nervous about tone, and I just kind of got on the wrong path and started doing things that weren't helpful and frankly did not work at all. But I didn't have a coach to get me back on track. And then when I came back to the States and finally talked to a coach and told her what I'd been doing, as soon as I said it, I was like, oh, that wasn't right. And she was like, no, it wasn't. So that's why I'm a coach, to give people what I didn't have and what I needed. But this is true of every set of materials, any kind of approach or method. An understanding of second language acquisition is really helpful, if not absolutely necessary. And there's tons of places. There's an alphabet soup of places that you can go to get second language acquisition training. Come to SIL, do a semester in our SLACA or our LACA classes. Go to ICCT, go to MTI, go to CIT. All those places can give you a grounding in second language acquisition that'll help you as you grow into a new world. But you also need a coach for encouragement and to keep you on track. Greg never intended for a random person to find the manuals online and just go it alone. That wasn't his intention at all. Another misconception is that participation, like growing participator approach, means that you will become a full, complete member, central member of your host community. But that's not the goal of the GPA. The goal is to become a legitimate peripheral participant. And that's from like sociology and anthropology. I've heard that phrase as well, becoming a legitimate peripheral participant. The goal is to become party to the discourse, to know what's going on and what people are talking about. Another misconception: everything with the name GPA on it is following the approach. Nope. I have personal experience of a colleague I coached being at a center that called itself GPA, but it was not. How can you know? Make sure that everything you're doing is pretty cute: communing, understanding, talking, evolving. You have to be full-time using the GPA. That's not true. I didn't do that in French study. No matter what you're doing, you can always add a nurturer on the side and then do what you can of the GPA. It's what I did in France. I was required to go to a school, and then I met with Mariode a couple of days a week on the side and used some of the GPA techniques. Okay, those are the misconceptions that I gathered in my little informal survey. So please chat one thing or a few things that you'd like to hear more about in the Q&A that we'll have in just a minute or two now. Okay, thank you. Keep chatting. So if you want more information about the GPA, Greg Thompson is making some things available to you that he hasn't made available publicly before. He wrote 90-second blurbs during COVID, just a few times a week, just things that you could read in 90 seconds about the growing participator approach. Those are compiled now. So if you want that compilation of 90-second blurbs, email me and I'll get those to you. The other thing he's making available are the module guides from the 2-week intensive training that Greg does. Greg and his team that we do overseas. So he's making those available to you. So email me if you'd like access to those. There's also growingparticipator.com, Growing Participator on Vimeo, which has Greg explaining the activities and then Angela demonstrating the activities, which is really, really helpful. My email address is there. You can also go to my blog where I talk about language learning, or you can find me on YouTube where I talk about language learning. Okay, and these are the sources for my talk. And now, if you would take your workshop workbook that you got, I don't know if you printed it out or if you have it electronically, and just jot down one thing that you'd like to remember from this presentation. Thank you so much for coming. Let me stop sharing. Yeah, thank you so much for coming. I look forward to talking with you in the Q&A, and please don't hesitate to email me. Thanks.